Alright guys, today we are finally getting to the bottom of the most asked question in the Wrath of the Lich King Classic raiding community. Who are actually the best DPS for Phase 2? It's been roughly 2 months since the release of Ulduar, so now is the only time where you can fairly accurately make a tier list. Before this time, you can really only make educated guesses based on sims and private server information, which normally is, let's be honest, pretty astonishingly incorrect. Now, to prove my point, I've got some tier lists here predicted a few months ago by some of the top YouTubers obviously in the field. I'm not calling anyone out by doing this because the last one is mine, and I actually think mine is actually the worst and most stupid of them all, probably because I made it 10 months ago. Here's the first one. It gets some of the S tier DPS correct, but a lot of them are very over-predicted on the DPS meters. Here we have a second one. The thing I find the funniest about this one is Elemental and Destruction and even on it. Poor Ellie and Destruction Warlock. And here's mine. I honestly think mine is the most stupid of them all. You know, forgive me, I did make this 10 months ago, and whenever I played Wrath of the Lich King on private servers, I always saw Feral Druids absolutely stomping the meters, probably because Hysteria, you know, obviously does count on in-game meters. So yeah, obviously these are very incorrect. Now, there's one other problem when it comes to looking at Warcraft logs to get accurate information on, you know, in order to make a DPS tier list. And that simple fact is that the top 1% of players, they are creating very unrealistic raiding scenarios in order to cheese and increase passes to, well, just to an unrealistic level that the average player is just not going to experience or see in the real raiding world of Warcraft. Nothing exemplifies this more than looking at the Affliction Warlock logs. So this is boss DPS for all the raids, you know, taking an average of all the boss DPS on every single boss. Obviously, we've got a member of Bipolar, which is specifically a passing guild. That's something that they focus on, and all power to them. I think that's a really cool way, personally, to play the game. But look, so we've got 10,500 DPS. And then we just have to go down the page a little bit, and at the bottom of the page, we've got people on 8,600. So even using this method that I used a month ago when creating a tier list of Ulduar DPS, this method is also not very accurate because you've got these people at the top who are just using strange, cheesy tactics to increase DPS to ludicrous, unrealistic levels. So yeah, just looking at the top 5% players on the statistics page of Warcraft logs, in my humble opinion, also is not an accurate way to determine a true, accurate tier list. So I think a more accurate way to do this is to look at the second page of Warcraft logs, where you just have fairly normal, high-passing raiders. So as you can see, the difference between the top DPS on this page, you know, 7,900, basically 8,000, and then at the bottom we have 7,800. There's only a 200 DPS difference between the person at the top and the person at the bottom of the second page. So looking at this data here, I think is much more accurate when determining a DPS tier list. This means that I have quite a lot of work to do because I have to now look at quite a lot of data for every single class in the, well, every single spec in the game. So yeah, I'll be right back. Now, before we look at the results, it's important to know that even this method of evaluation is flawed. I think you can't truly accurately work out a perfect tier list, to be honest. There's always going to be flaws in every single method. I think it's important to acknowledge and understand that. The main problem with this method is that it makes the specs that are less represented look much worse than they actually are, because if you go to that second page on Warcraft logs of a Destruction Warlock, for example, the DPS difference is huge, because there's only about 2,000 passes of Destruction Warlocks, and compare that to a spec that has over 200,000 passes, it's obviously going to be very different. But we can at least work out fairly accurately the DPS rankings of the more, the most played classes. But with this method, we are looking at overall boss DPS across the board, across the entire raid, and we're still not looking at it boss to boss basis, because then things change. It's important to know that as well, because certain specs are going to move up and down depending on the fight. But if I made a video looking at every single fight, it would just take way too long than it's worth, really. So here are the final results. If you don't see your spec on screen, we're going to talk about that very soon. Now, as you can see, the Affliction Warlock is on top, and I'm also going to put the DPS numbers beside this. Now, the problem with evaluating the Affliction Warlock is obviously there's a lot more people playing Affliction Warlock than other specs. So it's going to appear like the Affliction Warlock is way ahead than other specs, but so it's fairly inaccurate there, but I think we can all just agree that the Affliction Warlock just is the king of this phase, and let's just leave it at that. It's definitely going to be the top DPS no matter how you evaluate the Warcraft log data. But most other specs, even the less played specs like Ret and Fury, they have very similar amounts of total Warcraft log data. So now we can fairly accurately work out the other specs when they're compared against each other. As you can see, there isn't like a huge difference between specs at the top of A tier compared to B tier. So honestly, as long as you're playing a spec in S to B tier, you really don't have a lot to worry about, in my humble opinion. You are going to pump and you are going to top the meters from time to time, and you can compete with all the other DPS. Apart from maybe Affliction Warlock and Fire Mage. I think it's pretty obvious as to why Fire Spec has crawled up this tier list. Obviously, more people now have the tier set bonuses, which is going to be a good boost to their DPS. And also, there's a number of mechanics in Ulduar that just are really, really favourable to really buffing Fire Mage DPS on specific fights. So that's going to basically increase their average boss DPS across the entire raid by, let's be honest, a country mile. I think the underdog heroes of this tier is definitely going to be the Balanced Druid, Survival Hunter, and Shadow Priest. I don't think a lot of people really predicted them to do so well in Ulduar, but they definitely are. I think a lot of people definitely did overpredict the Frost Death Knight in this tier, but that's fine because it's a Frost spec anyway. And I know it kind of seems like I'm putting Assassination Rogue very low on this tier list, but honestly, as you can see by the DPS numbers, there's not even a noteworthy difference between Survival Shadow and Assassination. So just ignore the fact, ignore the order here, because honestly, you could just put these in any order. I just think that these specs are just perfectly, balanced with each other. They're doing very, very similar numbers, like within like less than 1% DPS difference. So honestly, just put them in one package, in my opinion. Like, to make people feel better, let's put the Rogue there. Like, it honestly does not matter. Now, obviously, the Destruction Warlock and the Marksman Hunter are not on here. It's pretty difficult using this method to compare the DPS results, of these specs compared to these other specs, because like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot less Warcraft log data on these specs. But my humble opinion is that Destruction Warlock is basically in this ballpark. It's at the bottom of B tier, competing with the Fury Warrior and the Ellie Shaman. Like, it's roundabout here. And the Marksman Hunter is basically at the bottom of C tier. It's around kind of like between the Ret and Feral and behind Feral. It's around about that area. And Arms and Frost are obviously definitely at the bottom. Just before I jump off, guys, please do me a huge solid and go and check out some of the videos on my second channel. I'm trying to get that channel monetized because right now I'm basically working to make videos on that channel, but YouTube are taking 100% of all the money, which is kind of irritating. Like, for some reason, they allow monetization on videos even though you're not at the threshold of where you can personally earn money, but they can. It's kind of a... Anyway, I won't talk too much about it because it'll bore you to death. Anyway, until my next video, ciao.